the United States has not exhausted all of the negotiating options with Iran. We have insisted that Iran negotiate only on the issue that we care about the most, which is the nuclear issue. But it really doesn't make sense from Iran's point of view to negotiate away what is essentially the highest card in their diplomatic hand, simply in order to be granted admission to the negotiating room. I think there is a possibility for a negotiated end to this escalating crisis between Iran and the United States, but we're not on that path now. We're on more of a path of confrontation, and the idea that we might offer Iran the chance to come to the table and discuss not only the issues we care about, but the issues Iran cares about is something that the United States has not yet gotten. Now, in my book, I start from what I think is a fairly obvious observation, and that is that the policies the United States has been following in the Middle East have not produced a peaceful, stable Middle East. In fact, after decades in which we have been so directly involved in the Middle East, we face a region which is just a pit of violence and terror and war and repression and hatred. Our policies were made for the Cold War, but the Cold War has been over for 20 years. The strategic environment in the Middle East has changed tremendously. There are looming new threats to the United States and the West emerging in that region. There are also very intriguing new opportunities for us in that region. But we're not taking advantage of any of that because our policy is still stuck in the past. This is one of the great challenges and actually weaknesses for the American foreign policy system. We are in a situation where we really need to reconceive our whole approach to the Middle East. We need to think of a new way going forward. And think not just about tomorrow and next week, but in a decade and 50 years from now, where would we like to be in the Middle East? We need to base our policies on national interest, on how we would like to see the Middle East and our role in it long into the future. This is something that our foreign policy establishment does not do very well. We're still stuck in policies of the past. It reminds me of that great line Einstein used to define insanity. He said, insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting different results. That's what we're doing in the Middle East. So I feel that we really need to think deeply about how we'd like to reconfigure our approach to that region, and Iran definitely plays a big role in it. Now, in the past, in the Cold War era, we shaped our approach to the Middle East largely according to our perceived view of the needs of Saudi Arabia and the needs of Israel. During this period, for some decades, the instinct in Washington was what Saudi Arabia wants, Saudi Arabia gets. What Israel wants, Israel gets. Now, it's generally assumed that the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia is based mainly on oil, and the relationship with Israel is based mainly on history and shared values. There's some truth to those cliches, but there's actually something deeper that bound those countries to the U.S. during the Cold War. And it was something that wasn't so clear back then. It's something that I write about in my book, but that is only now emerging, and that is that Israel and Saudi Arabia did a lot for the United States during the Cold War that was covert. It was clandestine. Nobody knew about it. Things that our other allies wouldn't do for us because they only wanted to cooperate with us during the day when it was light and everything was legal. We needed other kinds of help. For example, when the United States wanted to aid the military dictatorship in Guatemala during the 1980s, that was illegal because the Congress had banned U.S. aid to Guatemala. So we got Israel to arm the Guatemalan military, and then we repaid Israel indirectly. We did the same with South Africa. When the U.S. wanted to aid South Africa, the Congress wouldn't approve. Israel became our proxy. Saudi Arabia did the same thing. When we needed money for the Contras in Nicaragua, but the president was forbidden to allocate money because of an act of Congress, we got Saudi Arabia to write checks to support the Contras. Saudi Arabia paid a huge amount to help us support the Mujahideen war in Afghanistan. Their message to us essentially was, my checkbook is your checkbook. We have huge amounts of money and you can have as much of it as you want. So that's a pretty appealing approach. That was the Cold War configuration. Now, those relationships are still frozen in time. I'm trying to look forward now, see, as we look towards the Middle East in the future, what would we like to see? Well, our number one goal in the Middle East over the long term is stability. That should be our strategic goal. We have to think about ways to achieve that. One thing that I think we're doing now that's a mistake is that we're reacting, as we often do, to our emotions. That's not just Americans, but many people in the world are in a very emotional state now about what's going on in the Middle East. There is a lot of anti-Iran emotion and a lot of anti-Israel emotion coursing around the world. Actually, in an odd way, Israel and Iran are, in one sense, comparable at this moment, and that is that they're the two countries in that part of the world that are mistrusted and disliked by many of their neighbors, and also have many enemies in the wider world. Many people would like to punish Iran or punish Israel. This is a mistake. Iran and Israel are powerful countries in that part of the world. It's not a good idea to denounce them, punish them, sanction them, force them into a corner and make them feel alone and friendless. The opposite should be our policy. We should be doing whatever we can to coax these countries out of their paranoia and their fear. The world needs a big security concession from Iran. The world also needs security concessions from Israel. But countries only make security concessions when they feel safe. Therefore, it should be in the interest of the United States and everybody who looks for a stable Middle East to try to find ways to make Israel and Iran feel safe. Policies that alienate these countries, that make them feel alone and angry, are not good for anybody. Now, I said earlier that the United States needs to reconfigure its approach to the Middle East. How would we do this? Well, I start from the perspective that in the decades ahead, the United States is not going to be able to operate wisely in the Middle East just by itself. We're going to need partners. We'd like to find particularly partners in that region who share our general assumptions and who want to help us. Who would those partners be? How do we find the partners that we want to work with in the Middle East over the next decades? Well, I'd say when we look for countries with which we want to partner, we look for countries that fulfill two criteria. The first is you want countries whose long-term strategic goals are parallel to your own. But that isn't enough. In the past, the United States has gotten itself into a lot of trouble because we've built relationships that are only regime to regime. They're just alliances between ruling elites, and they leave out the people in the countries that we deal with. That's bad for us because in many cases these regimes are unpopular with their people. People don't like the regime, and they see the U.S. supporting the regime, and they don't like the U.S. either. So what we also need is a country whose society has something in common with our own. Those are the two criteria we need to look for. Countries that have long-term strategic goals like ours, and whose societies are recognizable to us. Saudi Arabia, for example, doesn't fit into that category. I was just in Saudi Arabia doing research for my book, and that is a uniquely bizarre country. The society of Saudi Arabia has nothing in common with the society of the United States. It's an absolute monarchy where women are not allowed to drive and dating is illegal. It's just a completely different way of life than everything that we're used to. So they make an odd partner with us. The two principal supporters of Saudi regime over all these decades have been the United States and the clergy of Wahhabi Islam. This was a very unstable basis for a regime because these two pillars are at war with each other inevitably. While the Saudis are trying to intensify their friendship with the United States, they're also giving billions of dollars to the Wahhabi clergy, which the clergy then uses to open up mosques and religious schools all across the Islamic world where whole generations of lost boys are taught how to chant the Quran and hate America. So this was not a good pairing for a regime, and it was inevitable that